going to do now is discuss the process workflow code customization. Specifically what we would like to do here, and let me show you, the way that we're going to implement this thing is that we have a show products table page. And what we want to do basically is mark a number of items as discontinued as an example. And my fancy graphic editing allowed me to create these two buttons, one with the letter M and one with the letter U up in the middle of the screen. And if I select a number of rows and click M, I would essentially then be able to mark it as discontinued, and then I can click U after selecting a few additional ones and mark it as discontinued. Now, a similar example like this might be, for example, where you are, let's say you have a set of expense reports that go through a set of workflow. So you might effectively see, like, let's say if I submitted my expense reports, then my boss might be able to say, I'm going to select these 5 of them and mark these as approved that go to the next stage. And some of them I may mark them as unapproved, and in which case they go back to me for additional documentation or whatever the case might be. And those are just some of the examples how you'd be able to do the process workflow. Let's see this actually application in actual use. So I've actually built this application prior to our webinar today. And what I can do is highlight a few of them. Some of them are no over here. So let's take the first 4 rows, and a couple of them are no, not discontinued. A couple of them are discontinued. I'm going to mark all of them as discontinued, and you can see all of them changing to yes. And I can do something similar, for example, mark these 3 and unmark them, and they will change to no. So that's kind of effectively what we want to implement over here. So how do we implement something like this? Well, as I mentioned to you, is that the user selects one or more rows. That's kind of the end user thing that we want. Clicks one of the buttons, and then the discontinued flag changes. So what is our strategy in order to make this change? The first thing that we want to do is we need to make some layout changes, and the second thing we need to do is make some code changes. And kind of at the high level, what we're going to be doing is adding a couple of buttons, the mark and the unmark buttons, if you will. And then we're going to essentially specify the page properties in order to handle what exactly needs to happen when the mark button is clicked and the unmark button is clicked. For the time being, we're just simply going to set those as custom buttons, and then we will need to then implement the actual code that handles that in our code customization. So we'll go through the next step and build this as click handlers for both the buttons. So that's our strategy. Let's go into and dive into the layout and how to go about doing that. What we're going to do is, I have this presentation, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do it within RSP Designer. The first step that I'm going to do is actually, I'm looking at a show products table over here, and specifically I'm looking at the page panel. So this is, as you know, with version 6.0. And what I'd like to do is add 2 buttons, basically, on the right-hand side of the button bar. So if you look at the button bar here, you will notice that I have the Reset Filters button, but beyond that there are no other buttons over here. So I would like to add 2 more buttons to the right of this thing. Let me switch over to design mode, and I'm looking at all of the different sections of the page that are displayed over here, and one specific page panel is the products table control that is displayed here. Within the products table control, there's 3 subsections, one for the filters area, one for the buttons, and one for the table. So specifically, I'm looking for the buttons area. And if you look here, I have a quick layout that is displayed with all of the different buttons that are on my button bar, the new button, the edit button, and so on. So what I'd like to do is go all the way to the end, and I'm looking at the reset button over here. And I will right mouse click, and if you notice, a lot of the functionality is available in the quick layout and in the page panels under the right click menu. I'm going to go ahead and select Insert Column to the right. So effectively what I'm doing is I'm inserting a column, and then what I'd like to do is actually insert a second column because I'm actually trying to add 2 buttons. So I've added 2 columns over here. Now, at this point in time, what I'd like to do is add a couple of buttons, and what I'd like to do is I can switch over to the Buttons tab over here. The Button tab in the toolbox lists for me a set of predefined buttons, like the new button, the edit button, and so on. In this particular case, there's no predefined button to mark something as continued or discontinued. So what I need to do is select it from the other toolbox. And specifically what I'm going to do here is I'm looking at a bunch of controls over here, and I see something called an image button, because what I'd like to do is display a little image. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply drag and drop an image button over here in column L, and I'm going to drag and drop another image button to the right of that thing. So I've now added two image buttons. Now, temporarily, the image buttons are just named image buttons. And then what I'd like to do at this point in time is rename them to something which is something more meaningful to me. So I'm going to right-mouse click and then rename. And in this particular case, name it Mark Discontinued. And I'll do the same thing with the next button, right mouse click, select rename, and mark as discontinued. And so now what I've done is I have created those two buttons. I have renamed them, but I have not gone in and specified the image for that button, for those buttons, nor have I specified what is the handler for that button right now. So at this point in time, I'm going to double-click and open up the Properties dialog box. When I double-click and open up the Properties dialog box, I typically open specifically to that particular button, and it shows me an image file. And right now it's bound to the new image by default, so it just picked something over here. Now it turns out that I went through and used like Paint and created something already called button bar mark. So I just erased the new image on that and replaced it with my own little M there, and I can add as that. I will repeat this same function for the unmark button. I'll go through and type in unmark. And there you have it. Now, I want to go back to the mark discontinued, and then what I need to do is specify the bindings, meaning that what should happen when the button is clicked. Now, by default, IronSpeed Designer gives you a whole bunch of options here, which is, add a row and, export data and pagination and things of that nature. What I'd like to do is select a custom, leave the redirect because I don't need to change the page. I want to stay on the current page, but select a custom binding over here, and I'll do the same thing for unmark. So at this point in time, all I've done is I've made the layout changes, and I press OK over here. I have renamed the buttons, and I have bound them to essentially custom handlers. At this point in time, in order for me to proceed, what I'd like to do is build the application, and by building the application, what happens is the default click handlers are generated for me automatically by IronSpeed Designer for mark discontinued and unmark discontinued. Obviously, IronSpeed Designer does not know what to do with those buttons, so it's because they're custom handlers, it's going to simply create a shell handler in the code behind files. At this point in time, so let me switch over to the presentation over here and just, there you go. So just to summarize, I selected the buttons area, and I then inserted two columns to the right. Then I dragged and dropped the two image buttons, followed by renaming the controls. And then what I did was I specified the image for each one of the buttons, mark and unmark, and I specified the bindings with the custom tab. So at this point in time, I'm done with the layout portion of it, and what I need to do is do the code portion of it. So the first thing that I need to do is, of course, as I mentioned to you, is build to create the code for the newly inserted buttons, and then to add click handlers. Now, one other great improvement that we have made in IronSpeed Designer 6.0 is that you can right-mouse click the specific control itself and go to a specific section that is relevant to the code that is relevant to that particular control. So if you look over here, when I right-mouse clicked, it brought up a menu. One of the menu items was code, and the other was documentation. And in both of those cases, what is listed for me is something which is very specific, which is in this particular case, I have a menu item called override the click handler for the mark discontinued button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that. And what it will do is it will automatically insert for me basically a blank click handler for the Mark Discontinued button that is available here. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to just so that I complete all of the things here, I'll repeat the same thing by inserting the unmark click handler as well, because I need to handle both of those buttons. So I'm going to insert both of them. They are both will be inserted one after another in my code behind file. I don't need to worry about where it was inserted and all of the details behind it. Now it placed me right into that method itself, and what I just need to do is now go ahead and start typing in my code. Now, before that, what I did was actually I went through and created some code for it. What I'm going to do is copy and paste this code, and then what I'm going to do is then explain to you what the code actually does. So all of these instructions, by the way, will be available to you after the webinar over here. So I'm going to open up here, and here is my Mark Discontinued click handler. I'm going to copy the inside of that function, inside of that method. Oops. And then I am going to paste this here. I'm going to remove the my base. There's no reason for me to call it my base because my base is really not doing anything. And I'll go ahead and indent it, and I'll explain that to you in a minute as far as what exactly this function is doing. So if you look at this Mark Discontinued function, the first and foremost thing is we are actually making a modification to the database. So what I need to do is I need to surround whatever changes that I'm making, because I'm updating the database, with a start and an end, and a start and a commit and an end transaction. So if you notice, I'm going to put this in a try-catch block. Got a start transaction, there's a commit transaction, and then there is an end transaction that is done in the finally part of the try-catch block. So those are the basic things that I need to do in order to make sure that my database gets updated appropriately once I have made those changes. And all of the records are going to be updated within one single transaction. So that's the goal that I want to accomplish over here. So I enclose it in a start and an end transaction. The next thing that I need to do is I need to essentially put a for loop. And in the for loop, what I need to do is go through all of the selected record controls. Now, I'm sitting here in what is called the products table control class. This class corresponds to essentially the entire table in the database on the page. So if you look here, if you look at the control hierarchy over here, you've got a page class, you've got a table control class, and a row control class. In this particular example, I'm circling the row class, but really the changes that I need to make is at the table control class here, because I need to essentially operate on all of the selected rows. So the first thing that I need to do is get a list of all of the selected record controls. And within the selected record controls, what I need to do is retrieve the specific record from the database given its unique ID. So in this particular case, what I want to do is for each one of the selected record controls, so let's say there are 4 record controls that I selected, I'm going to retrieve the first record. And I'm going to make sure that I pass the second argument to this getRecord function as true, indicating that I intend to modify this record. And what I do then at this point in time is set the discontinued flag to true, because in this particular case I'm marking as discontinued, and then I need to essentially save this record in the database. That's all I really need to do in terms of handling this thing. And again, just to summarize, I'm getting all of the selected record controls, followed by retrieving the specific record from the database. The getSelectedRecord controls retrieves those records from the user interface. It's indicating what has been selected effectively. I don't need to worry about figuring out, which are selected and which are not selected, because the getSelectedRecord controls will only return the selected record controls for me. And finally, I simply retrieve that record from the database, mark it as discontinued, save, and I'm done. That's basically all there is to it. One last thing that I need to do is mark the data changed as true. It's just a variable that you set in this function. And by setting this variable to true, what happens is I'm telling the rest of the IronSpeed Designer generated code that go ahead and refresh the table to display the new data effectively. So once, if I set data change to true, once I've gone through this function, the new data will be loaded and displayed for you on the screen. That's really all I need to do. I can also then copy the same function and really paste it into the unmark. Of course, I can make it more efficient later on, but for the time being, we're just going to do it the inefficient way. And the only difference between mark and unmark is my discontinued flag is now set to false. And that's all I really need to do as a difference between the two. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to switch over to the ASPX page within this and switch over to Live Preview. And what Live Preview will do is actually build the application and display the page for me over here. And lo and behold, I'm going to get the mark and the unmark with my different tooltips that are displayed over here. And if I so now choose to essentially, in this particular case, the discontinued flag is on the right-hand side completely over here. And so if I select Chai and Chang and mark as discontinued, hopefully, well, it did not, okay, I guess it is marked as, it's already marked as discontinued. So I'll select this one, mark as discontinued, and it'll switch over to yes. And if I so choose now to mark these two as unmarked as discontinued, I've unmarked them, and they are going to show up as no. So at this point in time, what I'd like to do is just summarize and then take questions from you. So as I mentioned to you, that the function basically has a start and a commit and an end transaction, get the selected record controls from the user interface, go through each one of the records, retrieve them from the database, and mark the specific field to true or false as the case might be. Okay, James is asking, how can I modify the exported text, Word, Excel, PDF to include the full text when the form displays the ellipse? Client likes Ajax pop-up for text but wants complete text on print outputs. James, as you know, this particular code customization training is related to process workflow. So I'm just going to give you a very high-level view of this thing. I can't really answer it in that. You may want to attend one of our other webinars or post this on the forum or ask support. In general, basically, the settings effectively with respect to Word, Excel, and PDF are specifically designed so that what you see on the screen is what you get in the Word, Excel, and PDF reports. So if you want to change that, then you will have to actually make the changes in the code customization. And if you go back to the thing, I'm just going to point out just something very quickly for you. So let's say I've got this PDF button over here. If I go to the controls file, or actually let me go to the design mode, and I have this PDF button over here. And if I go to the code and look at the show click handler that is generated. Now, obviously, I don't want to modify this show click handler because that is the generated code. I can always change it by overriding it. But let me select the show click handler to see what IronSpeed Designer generated for me. So I'm going to select this for the PDF button. And when I look at that code handler, I will see basically where this click handler then goes through, creates a start transaction, creates a new PDF report, goes through a variety of things. But in one aspect of it, it adds the various columns. These are just for the column headings basically. And then later on, what it does basically is retrieves all of the records and adds the data for this record. Now, what happens by default is that if you look at a particular field, that what happens is that in this particular case, I don't have an example of a field that may be large, but all of the formatting, including the appending of the ellipses and shortening that field, actually is handled through a format function. So if you replace this second argument of add data to essentially something different, which is either the full value as an example, then that's what you need to do in order to customize it and display the full value. So thank you for asking that question, but that's all I'm going to go through at this point in time. I'd rather focus on the workflow aspects at this point in time. Prasad is asking, suppose I'm trying to add a new record. How will I get the next value primary key? Prasad, again, this is, I think, a little bit outside the scope of this particular webinar, but in general, when you are adding a new record, the database, if you have set most database schema, allows you to specify that the primary key is essentially an ID that is provided by the database itself, so that it's not something that you have to actually do any programming on that. As long as you go into your appropriate database tool, like for example, if you were to go into Microsoft Access, you just set that field as auto number. If you set this in a SQL Server, you would be able to set that as essentially an ID field, which is a primary key, and it's auto increment. I forget exactly what the specific setting on SQL Server is, but if you do that, Iron Speed Designer automatically recognizes that and allows you to effectively use that to get a new ID. There is nothing more that you need to do in Iron Speed Designer in order to handle that. Now keep in mind that if you want to program it yourself, the disadvantage of programming it yourself is that if you have a multi-user application, which most web applications are, you need to make sure that you give it a unique ID. So for example, if I am on a web page and you are on another page, and Brooke is on a third page and James is on a fourth page, obviously each one of us, when we are adding a record simultaneously, we need to be able to be issued a unique ID. So there needs to be 4 different unique IDs that are issued. Well, the database tools are great for handling this thing automatically. So my recommendation is to use the database auto number, unique identifier, or whatever other choices that you have available in your database in order to accomplish this. Naveen is saying, how can I show only records which are marked as discontinued at the time of page load? Aha, very good question, Naveen. 2 things basically. Number 1, obviously when you have a particular screen that you're looking at, you could actually have created a different drop down over here. And in my next half of the presentation, which I'm going to talk about the filter by URL, you can accomplish this. Now, there are probably 3 or 4 ways of doing it. Number 1, I could go in and if I want to simply restrict this particular screen to always show the discontinued items, I can right mouse click on the page panel section, and I can select the panel wizard step for query. And here, what I can basically specify that I want to add a where clause. And in this particular case, I can basically select and say products, the discontinued field, and is equal to a particular constant. In this particular case, is 1. So if I do this, what this will do is it'll limit my particular screen always to only the discontinued values that are going to be displayed. This may be or may not be exactly what you want, because if you want to give user a choice in order to switch back and forth between discontinued and the currently available products, then obviously you would rather offer that as a drop down, as a filter basically. So if you notice over here, everything over here is discontinued. Nothing is currently being offered today. But obviously you may not want this particular change. So what I can do is I can remove that where clause from the query, and what I would like to do is, and I can do this 2 different ways. What I can go is go to the other options basically here, and actually let me cancel out of here. Let me select the filters, and what I'd like to do is right mouse select filters over here, and I can then now add the discontinued field as a filter that is available to me. So I right mouse click on the page panel section, select the filters section, brought up the filters step in the panel wizard, selected discontinued, press the finish. It adds a new row called the discontinued filter over here. There's a third way of doing it, which is I can simply add a new row, like below, for example, just to show you, and I can go to the filters, and I could have dragged and dropped the discontinued from over here and retrieve it. So that could have been also something that I could have done. But let me just leave it like this at this point in time, switch over to live preview and see exactly how it does. Now, so that's the third way of doing it. A fourth way of doing it now is you can also specify the discontinued flag on the URL, which will be the subject of the next one that I will go through. Okay, so now I've got the discontinued flag. I select no. It only shows me all of the currently available product. I select yes, shows me all of these, and I can select all. So that's how easy it is for you to actually go through and add a filter on this screen. Don is asking how to export the selected data into another table or on display. Don, again, I'm going to skip this question because it's not related to process workflow, but there is an export button over here that you can export to Excel, you can export to CSV, and that's all automatically available for you, so I would recommend that you utilize that in order to do that. But if you have more further questions on that one, you might ask on the forum or post to support. Ganesan is asking how to change the layout of selected portion in a page. I'm assuming that you're referring to some of the changes that I made in the design mode over here. What you have the ability in the design mode to do is effectively look at and change any of the things. So for example, if you are looking at this particular page, you've got a set of section called product name, supplier, category, and so on. Let's say, for example, I wanted to move the discontinued flag from there to somewhere between supplier and category. How can I accomplish that? And then second thing that I want to do is maybe what I want to do is put the product name and the supplier in one column rather than in two columns. Well, what I can do is go into the design mode. Again, I'm looking at a particular panel, in this case the products table control panel. I will zoom in on a specific section of that page, and specifically I'm going to zoom in on the table row section of the table that I'm looking at. Looking at the different columns that are displayed in an Excel-like spreadsheet. All I need to do is simply drag and drop, because I wanted to combine the supplier and the category into one column. I need to drag and drop in this thing. And in this particular case, I'm going to right mouse click and remove this column so that, okay, before I do that, I can also copy the label over here and then remove this column. And then what I can do is, let's say, for example, I want to, actually, I'll undo this so that I have an empty column here. And what I want to do is move the discontinued flag all the way from the right-hand side into here. So I grab it, all this here, move it all the way here. Do the same thing with the label. I drag and drop the label all the way over here. And finally, I'll go through and remove this particular column from here. And now I've got the supplier and the category listed in the same column and the discontinued flag in the next column after that. I made that change, switch over to the live preview, and I can see that that change. So that's just one example of the kind of changes that you can make. What happened over here? Did I not make that change? I made that change. Okay. I thought I made that change. Okay, looks like Murphy struck here. Okay, so sometimes what happens is if there are any errors, build errors, it may give me a thing. So I don't know exactly what happened over here. Let me just look at the build error. Show output over here. No output over here. Yeah, there's no errors over there. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what happened there. But essentially what I will do is I'll leave it at that and say that that's effectively how easy it is for you to change that. Am I showing a different page here? Well, the discontinued flag changed over here, but the supplier and category did not change over here. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, it did change over here, right? Column headings. So my first column is product name, the second column is supplier, and the third column is category. I'm sorry, I did change that. So if you switch over to live preview, the product name is in the first column. We see Chai, Chang, and so on. And what happened is the supplier is exotic liquids, and the category is beverages, basically. So it did change it simply on the same line, and so it confused me. What I want to do now is actually, if I wanted to display that on the next line, let me just say, one of the advantages of the cell editor at the bottom is I can type in really any HTML or any text over here. And so I'll put a label called supplier and category over here. I could, for example, even put a bold tag on some of these things and say this displays as bold. I'll do the same thing with the supplier. And so what happens now is if I switch over to live preview now, so sorry for the confusion over here. I tricked myself in it. There you go. Now I have supplier and category displayed in bold and in there. So just this is a good quick lesson as well. By the way, some of these changes are so fine that sometimes it's hard to notice that you've actually made those changes. But more importantly, the other important point that I want to make here is that if you look at the cell editor at the end of the day at the bottom of this thing over here allows you to type in really any HTML and any text. And whatever you type in is going to be displayed in the live preview over there. So the only thing that's specifically changed is that gen::field value, which are the code generation tags, are going to be changed in order to effectively replace with the appropriate ASP controls for you. But other than that, you can use the cell editor to type in anything that you want, just like what I did here with respect to the label, a prefix, for example, or a label before it, change it to bold, put a new line here, and so on. It is asking, I removed the menu panel. How can I put it back? There is no add menu panel anywhere. There is actually an add menu panel. It is actually available to you from inside of the new panel thing over here, where you can effectively add it. Actually, you can add it from 2 or 3 different places. And you can, no, not in here, I'm sorry. So you can go over here and look at, so if you right mouse click of any of the sections, imagine I deleted the menu over here. I will only have this available. So I right mouse click and insert menu is available. Keep in mind that one of the important things I want to say is that right mouse click is very important. Any place where you're confused, where you need to know something, right mouse click and see what's available for you. You can insert a new panel above it, below. You can insert a menu. You can insert a header, footer, rename a panel control, and so on. Glenn is saying if you wanted to have only one button, as in your example, which swap the true-false setting rather than making it true and other making it false, you would just have one button and one function. Can you just retrieve the current setting of the row and reverse it to true or false? Can you show how that would be done? Sure. I mean, that's fairly easy to do. Let's say, for example, I have I'm going to use the mark button, and I'm going to make this essentially toggle as an example, right? So how do I do that? Well, in this particular case, what I want to do is I'm going to simply look at the code, and I'm looking at, so I go back to controls, and if I look at the code at the top, and here is my rec discontinued flag set to true when I'm marking it as discontinued. What I could do basically is simply, instead of changing it to true, I will change it to not of rec.discontinued. So I'm basically doing the opposite of whatever it was set to effectively, right? So if it was set to true, the not of true will become false. If it was set to false, not of false will become true. So I'm essentially swapping the value here. So if I switch back to the ASPX, okay, I want to save it. And I go to live preview, it's going to quickly build and display that. So now I'm looking at Chai and Chang. So now if you look at this is yes and this is no, I click on mark. Hopefully this will become no and yes when I'm done with that. There you go. So no and yes. So that's how easy it is for you to do that. Mike is asking if you have 5 different roles, and if you don't want, if you have 5 different roles, admin, director, manager, author, user, and you don't want to show mark or unmarked buttons to users in the managers, authors, and users role. A very good question over here. Now, I don't have application security set over here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly set up a default security here. I don't have a user roles table, so I may just have to do it based on, I'll just make up an employees table as the user table, and I'm going to say my username field is last name, and my password field is first name. I'll just make this up, and I'm going to just go ahead and finish. So I just added application security over here. So I don't want to disable security. Okay, well, I'll disable security for the time being. Because this way you don't have to sign in when you are switching over to live preview. But what I really wanted to show you is the following, which is that what you can do is switch over to design mode. go to Mark as Discontinued, bring up the Properties dialog box, and go to the Security tab, and you have an option to basically say, okay, show only signed-in users, not signed-in users, or any of the different values over here. If you've specified the roles table, all of the roles will be showed over here. This will not be grayed out, and you'll be able to select the specific roles that are there. So this way what happens is that button is going to be, so I'm only